This is Letter from America. Today's topic is President Mnangagwa's ZANU PF government has declared war on civil society in Zimbabwe. On May 3 this week, the world observed the Freedom of the Press Day to stress press freedom around the world. But for Zimbabwe, human rights and press freedom are unfulfilled dreams 43 years after the country gained independence in 1980. The elusive nature of press freedom in Zimbabwe is captured very well in an editorial by Zimbabwe's independence editor Faith Zaba. She writes, as the globe marks press freedom on May 3, it is important to reflect on the state of the media in Zimbabwe. Over the years, Zimbabwe has faced numerous challenges in terms of press freedom. It is crucial for us to recognize the progress made so far while acknowledging the work that still needs to be done and retrogressive steps taken by the Zimbabwe government. Faith Zaba adds, in recent years, Zimbabwe has made some positive strides towards promoting press freedom. In 2020, the government amended the media laws, including repealing the Draconian Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or IPA, and the enactment of the Freedom of Information Act. Faith Zaba says these changes were celebrated by the media fraternity as they represented a significant shift towards enhancing transparency and accountability in government operations. But Faith Zaba points out the elusive nature of these actions. She writes, however, while we welcome the positive developments, the state seems bent on putting in place retrogressive measures in enjoyment of social and economic and political rights through the enactment of laws like the Private Voluntary Organization Amendment Bill and plans to amend the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act. Once the amendments become law, it will be illegal to willfully injure the sovereignty of or national interests of Zimbabwe. This criminalizes engagement with foreign embassies without government approval, Faith Zaba writes. The Data Protection Act in 2021, which established the Cybersecurity and Monitoring and Interception of Communications Center housed in the Office of the President and Cabinet, is another bad law that is another of the bad laws that were enacted as we popped champagne after the repeal of IPA. Zimbabwean journalists continue to encounter numerous challenges in their line of duty. One of the most significant issues they face is the harassment, arrest, and detention of journalists who report on sensitive issues such as corruption. Award-winning Faith Zaba continues. This has been a long-standing issue in Zimbabwe. It has created an atmosphere of fear of arrest or harassment for reporting on certain topics. It is imperative that journalists are protected. After all, it's a right guaranteed in the Zimbabwean constitution. Faith Zaba continues. In 2018, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, or MISA, recorded 32 violations on journalists. The figure increased to 36 in 2022 as the country headed for harmonized elections to be held in July or August that year. This, Faith Zaba's note, is a worrying trend. Faith Zaba adds, as we celebrate World Press Freedom Day, it is crucial for the Zimbabwean government to take concrete steps towards promoting and protecting press freedom. This includes ensuring that journalists are not harassed or intimidated in their line of work, promoting media diversity and ownership, and providing support to media outlets to ensure their financial viability. Faith Zapa says it is essential to ensure that the data is affordable and internet is accessible to the majority of Zimbabweans, as this allows access to information. Faith Zapa writes, press freedom is essential for nurturing democracy, transparency, and accountability. It is crucial for the Zimbabwean government to take concrete steps towards promoting and protecting press freedom and freedom of expression. Similarly, the media fraternity must continue to play its role in promoting transparency, accountability, and providing accurate information and news. Ultimately, Faith Zapa writes, press freedom is essential for the development of a vibrant and democratic society, and it is the responsibility of all stakeholders to work towards achieving it. Faith Zapa concludes, journalists have a crucial role to play in informing the public and holding those in power accountable. It is therefore crucial for journalists to continue to report on sensitive issues fearlessly and without hesitation or of retaliation. Faith Zapa writes. And yet, President Mnangagwa's ZANU PF government has declared war on Zimbabweans. This message was heard loud and clear around the world from human rights organizations. The Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, which represents 350 citizens organizations, has condemned the ZANU PF government for violating Zimbabwe's human rights and press freedom. Crisis in Zimbabwe is a coalition of citizens organizations that include churches, labor, women, youths, students, farmers, war veterans, private voluntary organizations, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and community-based organizations, trusts and social movements. All of them operate in Zimbabwe. On December 10 last year, the world observed the Human Rights Day. This is an annual event that is observed by the international community every year on December 10. It celebrates the day in 1948 when the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. There are two key sections of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that were the focus of last year's remembrance of this declaration. One was basic human rights, which are being violated in many countries around the world, like Zimbabwe. The other was the freedom of the press, where journalists, again, like in Zimbabwe, are being persecuted, jailed, abducted, tortured, or even killed. The Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, through its partners, monitors and documents human rights abuses and freedom of the press violations in Zimbabwe. On the occasion of the World Human Rights Day, Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition sharply criticized the government of Zimbabwe for its failure to uphold and respect human rights and press freedom in the country. In its report, the Crisis Coalition says ZANU PF government has created a politically toxic environment with high levels of corruption. President Mnangagwa's government has failed to put human rights at the center of its development initiatives, the statement read. Severe laws, judicial capture, unlawful arrests, persecution of civil society actors, and the ongoing random constitutional amendments continue to reverse the democratic gains attained by the adoption of the new constitution in Zimbabwe. The late President Robert Mugabe used to threaten human rights activists by saying he would descend on them with a hammer. This hammer is now very clearly in Mnangagwa's hands, and he is using it with ruthless force in his war against Zimbabweans. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948. The basic principle of this declaration is Article 10, which states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This means all human beings are born with certain rights which cannot be taken away. Article 10 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has a right to the freedom of opinion and expression without interference. Following this Declaration of Basic Human Rights, there were a number of agreements that adopted this declaration. Principle 26(1)(a) of the African Charter emphasizes that the right to access to information means every person has the right to access information held by public bodies and relevant private bodies expeditiously and inexpensively. This right of expression was adopted in the Declaration of Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa in 2002. This declaration also states that African governments have an obligation to respect press freedom by creating a safe working environment for journalists, especially through protection for freedom of the press. The Summit for Democracy, organized by the United States and some European countries, challenged governments to recommit to the protection of journalists. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken announced the United States was investing more than $200 million to the International Fund for Public Interest Media to help independent media. From these international agreements on human rights and freedom of the press and expression, it stands out that Mnangagwa's ZANU PF government has broken all of them. Human rights organizations as well as the U.S. Embassy in Harare have highlighted significant human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. These abuses include unlawful or deliberate killings of civilians, especially supporters of MDCT and CCC, the biggest opposition party in the country, by security forces. 2. Torture and detention of human rights activists, also by security forces. 3. Cases of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. 4. Harsh and life-threatening prison conditions of political prisoners or detainees. 5. Unlawful interference by the government with privacy. 6. Serious problems with the independence of the judiciary. 7. Serious government restrictions on free expression, press, and the internet, including violence, threats of violence, or unjustified arrests or prosecutions against journalists, censorship, site blocking, and the existence of criminal libel laws. 8. Substantial interference with the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. 9. Restriction on freedom of movement. 10. Restrictions on political participation. 11. Widespread acts of corruption. 12. Lack of investigation of and accountability for violence against women. 13. Crimes involving violence or threats of violence targeting women and girls. And 14. Human rights organizations charged the government took very few steps to identify or investigate human rights violations. There can be no doubt that the Mnangagwa ZANU PF government has violated most, if not all, of the basic human rights and freedom of the expression in Zimbabwe. And in doing so, Mnangagwa has declared war on the civil society in Zimbabwe and has declared war against the Zimbabweans.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of